I'm Chris Evans, 37 years old. 14 years ago, a staged family intervention on the eve of my 23rd birthday changed my life forever. While I was standing in my own living room, holding a cheap $6 grocery store cake I had bought for myself, my parents looked me dead in the eye and announced that my birthday was canceled because my golden child brother was feeling overshadowed and needed the family's undivided attention. They erased my existence right to my face. But there is one thing they did not know. I had already overheard the truth about my brother's sudden emotional crisis, and my grandfather had secretly set up a college fund that would become the cornerstone of my revenge. And now, they are the ones facing absolute financial ruin, desperately begging for a lifeline, while I hold the deed to the very roof over their heads. Before I tell you exactly how I turned the tables and took back my life, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us go back to where it all began. I can still smell the artificial vanilla of that cheap cake. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just finished an exhausting 8-hour shift at the local hardware store. My boots were heavy with dust, my back was aching, and my bank account was practically running on fumes. But it was the day before my 23rd birthday, and I wanted to do something, anything, to acknowledge my own existence. I stopped by Walmart on the way home and picked up a small, square sheet cake from the bakery section. It had "Happy Birthday" scrawled across the top in bright blue frosting that was already starting to smear from the summer heat. Cost me exactly $6. It was pathetic, but it was mine. I walked through the front door of my childhood home, expecting the usual indifference. Instead, I walked into what looked like a tribunal. My mother, Eleanor, my father, Arthur, and my younger brother, Liam, were sitting in the living room. They were positioned in a semicircle on the worn leather couches, waiting for me. The television was off. The air was thick and heavy. The second I walked in, my mother looked up. She did not look at me with love or even basic parental warmth. She wore this practiced expression of deep disappointment. Before I could even put my keys in the bowl, she delivered the news. "Chris, we have decided there will not be any birthday celebration for you this year," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, overly gentle tone she used when she wanted to sound like a martyr. "Liam has been feeling incredibly overshadowed lately. His mental health is declining, and he needs the family's full, undivided attention right now." I just stood there, the plastic container of the cake crinkled slightly in my grip. "You understand, right?" she continued. It was not a question. It was a command. "That means no celebration tomorrow. No cake, no presents, no special dinner. We are going to spend tomorrow evening talking about Liam's feelings and how we can better support his dreams moving forward." Liam was sitting next to her, staring down at the carpet, looking appropriately distressed. He even managed to squeeze out a few fake tears that glistened in the corner of his eyes. "I am sorry, Chris," Liam whispered, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I know this is hard for you, but I just feel so invisible sometimes. It is like nobody sees how much I am struggling to find my path. I just need to know this family cares about me." Invisible. The golden boy of the house, the kid whose face covered every inch of wall space, whose trophies filled the mantelpiece, whose whims dictated every single financial decision my parents ever made, claimed he felt invisible. If I had walked into that room blindly, maybe I would have argued. Maybe I would have begged for just an hour of their time to cut my cheap cake. But something had fundamentally broken inside me 3 hours earlier. You see, my shift at the hardware store had ended early that day because a shipment got delayed. I had come home around 3 in the afternoon. The house was quiet. I walked down the hallway toward my tiny bedroom, the same room I had slept in since I was 5, and I heard Liam's voice coming from his room. His door was cracked open just an inch. He was on the phone with a friend, and his voice did not sound depressed or fragile. He sounded smug. He sounded exactly like the manipulative predator he was. "Yeah, man, I already told Mom that I need extra attention right now," Liam had said, laughing. "I mean, Chris's birthday is tomorrow, But who cares? I told them I have been feeling really depressed and overlooked. Mom bought it completely. She is going to tell him tonight that we are not celebrating. I had frozen in the hallway, the floorboards silent beneath my work boots. The best part, Liam continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is that nobody knows I flunked out of college 3 weeks ago. That dismissal letter from the registrar is going to arrive in the mail any day now. But by then, I will have convinced them that I dropped out because I was too stressed from the family focusing on Chris instead of me. Can you believe he still lives here at 23? What a total loser. He laughed again. That cruel, sharp sound I had heard 1,000 times growing up. I already have Mom convinced that we need to spend Chris's birthday talking about my feelings and my future, Liam bragged. By the time that letter arrives, they will be so worried about my mental health that they will not even care about the $40,000 they wasted on my tuition. $40,000. My parents had told me they could not spare a single dime to help me with community college because money was too tight. They told me I had to pull myself up by my bootstraps. But they had handed Liam 40 grand to go to a party school, and he had thrown it away on alcohol, fraternities, and utter laziness. And now, he was using my birthday, the one day a year I asked for the bare minimum of human decency, as a human shield to protect himself from the consequences of his own failures. So, when I stood in that living room 3 hours later, listening to my mother cancel my existence and watching my brother cry his crocodile tears, I did not feel angry. I felt absolute, chilling clarity. I looked at my father, Arthur. He was staring at his hands, his shoulders slumped. He knew this was wrong. He knew it was insane. But he had given up fighting Eleanor a decade ago. He chose his own peace over my protection. I did not scream. I did not throw the cake at the wall. I simply walked over to the coffee table, set the $6 Walmart cake down right in front of Liam, and looked at my mother. Message received, I said. I turned around, walked down the hall to my tiny bedroom, and started packing. I did not pack like someone who was running away. I packed like someone who was evicting themselves from a toxic wasteland. Every shirt, every pair of worn-out jeans, every important document went into 3 duffel bags. Took me less than an hour. 23 years of life in that house, and my entire existence fit into 3 bags. They probably thought I was sulking in my room. They had no idea I was about to disappear from their lives completely. I thought the worst part of my life was the humiliation of that living room. I was so incredibly wrong. The real storm was just gathering. The silence of my room as I packed was deafening. Every time I zipped a bag closed, it felt like I was sealing a coffin on my childhood. To understand how I could walk away from my own blood so coldly, you have to understand the decades of groundwork my parents laid to make me feel utterly worthless. Let me take you back to when Liam was 8 years old. Before that year, we were a relatively normal, lower-middle-class family. But that summer, Liam won a regional junior sports tournament. It was not the Olympics. It was a local, low-stakes competition that desperate, suburban parents convinced themselves was the gateway to professional stardom. I still remember the exact moment the dynamic in our house shifted permanently. We were standing on the artificial turf of the sports complex. They handed Liam this cheap, gold-painted plastic trophy. My mother, Eleanor, looked at him with a kind of fanatic, religious awe that I had never seen on her face before. From that single afternoon forward, everything we had, every dollar, every weekend, every ounce of emotional bandwidth, was redirected toward Liam's imaginary future. The house slowly transformed into a shrine dedicated to his mediocre talents. Whenever I brought home a straight-A report card, my mother would barely glance at it, offering a dismissive nod before returning to polishing Liam's participation medals. When I was 15, I spent 3 months building a complex robotics project for the state science fair. I won first place. I was so proud I thought my chest would burst. I rushed home, holding the certificate, practically vibrating with excitement to show my parents. When I walked into the kitchen, My mother was on the phone, frantic. Liam had scuffed his expensive athletic shoes, and she was ordering a replacement pair with expedited shipping. I held out my certificate. She shooed me away with her hand like I was a stray dog begging for scraps. "Not now, Chris," she snapped. "Can't you see we have a crisis?" My achievement vanished beneath the overwhelming weight of Liam's minor inconvenience. I learned very early on to celebrate my victories alone in the dark, while the living room remained Liam's personal stage. The financial toll on our family was devastating. My father, Arthur, was a mechanic at a local manufacturing plant. He was a decent man, but a profoundly weak one. As Liam's sports gear, travel teams, and private coaching fees escalated, my dad started picking up double shifts. He practically lived at the factory. I watched the life drain out of him year by year. His posture collapsed, his hands were permanently stained with grease, and his eyes carried the hollow, dead look of a man who was drowning in debt but was too terrified of his wife to speak up. He would come home at 9 o'clock at night, eat a cold plate of leftovers in absolute silence, and then sit in the living room while Eleanor praised Liam for a practice session he had half-heartedly completed. My father's salary was bled dry, drained into the bottomless pit of Liam's entitlement. The Thanksgiving dinners were the worst. We would sit around the table, and the entire conversation would revolve around Liam's schedule, Liam's diet, Liam's prospects. I was a ghost eating turkey. Once, when I was 16, my Aunt Diane came over for the holidays. She was my mother's older sister, a sharp woman who noticed everything. I was wearing a flannel shirt I had bought from a thrift store because my parents claimed we had no budget for my winter clothes, while Liam sat across from me in a brand new, $200 designer jacket. Aunt Diane looked at me, then looked at Liam, and her mouth tightened into a thin, hard line. She saw the injustice. I know she did. I caught her looking at me with profound pity later that night while I was washing the dishes alone in the kitchen. But she never said a word. She never stood up to Eleanor. She chose the path of least resistance, becoming a silent witness to my emotional starvation. It taught me a brutal lesson. People might see your pain, but very few will actually step in to stop it. The only person who saw through the madness and actually gave a damn was my grandfather, Henry. He was my father's dad, an old-school, no-nonsense retired carpenter with calloused hands and a spine of absolute steel. Henry and Eleanor hated each other. Eleanor thought Henry was unrefined and stingy because he refused to fund Liam's sports fantasies. Henry thought Eleanor was a narcissistic fool raising a parasite. Because of this feud, Henry was effectively banished from our house. But he found ways to reach me. During the summers, he would secretly meet me at the local park or the public library. He would bring me ham sandwiches wrapped in foil and a thermos of black coffee. We would sit on a park bench, and for the first time in my life, an adult would actually look me in the eye and listen. I told him about my grades. I told him about my part-time job at the hardware store, sweeping floors and stocking shelves. I told him about my dreams of getting a business degree. "You listen to me, Chris," Grandpa Henry said to me one afternoon, his rough hand gripping my shoulder. "This world does not owe you a damn thing. But your parents owe you a fair shake, and they are failing you. You cannot fix them. You cannot make them see you. But you can build yourself out of steel so that by the time you leave that house, you never have to ask them for a crumb of bread." Those meetings with Henry were my oxygen. They kept me from losing my mind. They gave me a compass in a house where the magnetic north was always pointed directly at Liam. By the time I hit my senior year of high school, the disparity was almost comical. Liam was driving a leased sports car that my father could barely afford, racking up speeding tickets that my mother quietly paid off. I was taking the city bus to my shifts at the hardware store, saving every penny in a shoebox under my bed. When it came time for college, the conversation was brief and brutal. "We have to prioritize Liam's university fund," Eleanor told me over dinner one night, not even looking up from her plate. "His athletic career requires a prestigious program. You are smart, Chris. You can figure out student loans or go to community college. We just do not have the 401k to dip into for both of you. It was a lie. They had the money. They just chose where to invest it. They chose the golden child. So I stayed home. I enrolled in the local state college, paying my own way by working 35 hours a week at the hardware store. I bought my own food. I paid for my own textbooks. I was a tenant in my own home, tiptoeing around Liam's chaotic schedule. All of this, the years of neglect, the blatant favoritism, the exhaustion of watching my father work himself to the bone to fund my brother's delusions. All of it culminated on that Tuesday evening. The night they decided my 23rd birthday was an inconvenience to Liam's fragile ego. Sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at my 3 packed duffel bags, I realized that hoping for their love was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It was destroying me. They were never going to wake up one day and realize my worth. I had to determine my own value. I waited until the house was dead silent. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2 a.m. I slung the bags over my shoulders and quietly opened my bedroom door. I thought my exit would be completely unobserved. I was wrong. The ultimate betrayal of that night was not just my mother's cruelty. It was the final, pathetic gesture from the man who was supposed to protect me. I stepped into the dark hallway, the floorboards creaking softly under my weight. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall near the kitchen. It was my father, Arthur. He was wearing his faded bathrobe, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. He looked 10 years older than his actual age, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion and guilt. He saw the bags. He knew exactly what was happening. For one desperate, foolish second, the little boy inside me hoped he would say, "Stop, don't go. I will fix this. I will stand up to your mother." Instead, he walked slowly toward me, reaching into the pocket of his robe. He pulled out his worn leather wallet. With trembling fingers, he extracted 5 crumpled $100 bills. He held them out to me in the dark. "Chris," he whispered, his voice cracking, "take this. It is all I have right now in my personal stash." I stared at the money. $500. It was more cash than he had ever given me in my entire life. "I know things are not fair," my dad continued, his voice barely audible, thick with shame. "I know we failed you, but I do not know how to fix it anymore. Your mother, Liam, I just do not have any fight left in me, son. I am so sorry." I looked at this broken man. He was offering me a $500 severance package for 23 years of neglect. He was paying me to leave quietly so he would not have to deal with the confrontation. It was an apology, yes, but it was the most cowardly apology a father could ever give a son. It somehow hurt worse than my mother's blatant cruelty. Eleanor was malicious, but Arthur was an enabler. His silence had permitted my abuse. I reached out and took the crumpled bills. Not because it made things right, but because I was walking out into the night and I needed the survival funds. "Thanks," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion. "Where will you go?" he asked, looking at the floor. "Does it really matter?" I replied. He flinched as if I had physically struck him. He did not argue. He just nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping even further, and stepped aside to let me pass. I walked out the front door, not looking back. I threw my bags into the trunk of my beat-up 1999 Honda Civic, a car I had bought with my own money from a junkyard and fixed up myself, and turned the key. The engine sputtered to life. As I drove away from the curb, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house was completely dark. They were sleeping soundly, completely unaware that their ultimate scapegoat had just permanently left the premises. I drove through the empty streets of our suburban town. The yellow streetlights flickered overhead. I only had one destination in mind. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway of a small, modest house across town. It was Grandpa Henry's place. I killed the engine, walked up to the wooden porch, and knocked on the door. It was nearly 3 a.m. A light flicked on inside. A moment later, the door swung open. Grandpa Henry stood there in his flannel pajamas, holding a heavy Maglite flashlight. He looked at my face, then looked down at the duffel bags slung over my shoulder. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply stepped to the side, opening the door wider. "Get in here. The mosquitoes are vicious tonight," he grumbled. I dropped my bags in his small living room. Henry walked straight to the kitchen and started boiling water on the stove. He made 2 mugs of instant coffee, black and bitter, and set one down on the kitchen table in front of me. He sat across from me, his calloused hands wrapped around his mug, waiting. I told him everything. I told him about the grocery store cake. I told him about the intervention in the living room. I told him about Liam's fake depression and the phone call I overheard about the dismissal letter and the $40,000 of wasted tuition. Finally, I told him about Arthur handing me the $500 in the hallway. Henry listened in absolute silence. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth would crack. When I finished, the silence in the kitchen stretched on for several minutes. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. "Your mother is a fool," Henry finally said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And your father is a coward. I love my son, but Arthur let that woman rip his spine out decades ago." He took a sip of his coffee, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "You can stay here in the spare room," Henry said firmly. "No rent, no conditions. But you are going to make me a promise right here, right now, Chris." "Anything," I said. "You are going to finish your degree. You are going to work your fingers to the bone. And you are going to become so unshakably successful that those people will eventually have to look up just to see the bottom of your shoes. The best revenge in this world is not anger. It is living incredibly well." I nodded. "I promise." Henry stood up, walked over to a heavy oak bookshelf in the corner of the room, and pulled out an old metal lockbox. He brought it back to the table, unlocked it with a small brass key from his pocket, and pulled out a stack of bank statements. He slid them across the table to me. "Look at the bottom line," he ordered. I picked up the top statement. It was a savings account under my name with Henry as the custodian. The balance was $8,450. I stared at the number, my brain struggling to process what I was looking at. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "That is your college fund," Henry said gruffly. "Every time Eleanor demanded money for Liam's sports camps, or his private coaching, or his fancy car, I took the exact amount she asked for and put it into this account for you. I knew this day was coming. I knew they would dry you out and leave you with nothing. This is your foundation, Chris. Use it." Tears, hot and fast, suddenly pricked my eyes. For 23 years, I thought I was entirely alone in the world. But this old man had been quietly, stubbornly building a safety net for me in the background. My parents had wasted $40,000 on a golden child who threw it all away on beer and parties. My grandfather had saved $8,000 for the invisible child, and it felt like $1 million. That night in Grandpa Henry's spare room, lying on a lumpy mattress, the heavy weight of my past finally lifted off my chest. I was no longer Chris, the forgotten brother. I was Chris, the survivor, and I was going to build an empire. The next morning, my new life began. I kept my full-time job at the hardware store, working 40 hours a week. I used the money from Henry's secret college fund to pay my tuition in cash, avoiding student loans entirely. I maxed out my credit hours every single semester, taking summer classes and night courses. I barely slept. I lived on cheap ramen and diner coffee. But I had a mentor. In the evenings, Grandpa Henry and I would sit on his back porch and he would teach me. Henry had dabbled in real estate decades ago. He knew how to frame a wall, how to spot a bad foundation, how to calculate property taxes, and how to deal with city zoning permits. He transferred 40 years of blue-collar wisdom directly into my brain. "Real estate, Chris, is the only game where the rules don't care about your feelings. Henry would say, pointing a calloused finger at me. Bricks don't lie. Concrete doesn't manipulate. You buy it cheap, you fix it right, and you hold on to it. It is the ultimate equalizer. I absorbed it all like a sponge. I was preparing for a war, and knowledge was my ammunition. Meanwhile, across town, the time bomb I had left behind in my parents' house was finally detonating. I thought I could just fade away quietly, but toxic families never let their scapegoats escape without a fight. The storm I had predicted was making landfall, and it was brutal. 2 weeks after I left the house, Liam's dismissal letter from the university registrar finally arrived in the mail. The illusion of the poor, depressed golden child shattered instantly. The reality was stark and undeniable. Liam had failed every single class due to a sheer lack of attendance. The university was officially cutting him loose, and the bill for the $40,000 tuition was due. I knew exactly when the letter arrived because my phone exploded. My mother, Eleanor, called me 17 times in the span of 3 hours. When I didn't answer, she started leaving voicemails. They progressed from frantic to furious to masterfully manipulative. I sat on Grandpa Henry's porch, listening to the voice messages on speakerphone so Henry could hear the chaos he had predicted. "Chris, where are you? You need to come home right now," Eleanor's voice shrieked from the tiny speaker. "Your brother is having a severe crisis. The university made a terrible mistake. We need to present a united family front. We need you to come home and help figure out the finances. How can you abandon us like this? Call me back immediately." She wasn't calling because she missed me. She was calling because the family needed their buffer back. Without me there to absorb her anger and Arthur's resentment, they were forced to actually look at Liam and acknowledge the monster they had created. They needed me to come back and be the responsible one. Maybe even co-sign a loan or hand over my hardware store paychecks to cover Liam's catastrophic debts. I looked at Henry. He raised an eyebrow. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I pressed the delete button on the voicemail. Then, I went into my phone settings and blocked my mother's number. I blocked Arthur. I blocked Liam. "I'm going to work," I told Henry. I cut them off completely. Total radio silence. It was the most empowering feeling in the world. A year later, at 24, I graduated college with a degree in business administration. I finished a 4-year program in 3 years. My graduation ceremony was small. I didn't invite anyone from my immediate family. The only person sitting in the bleachers cheering for me was Grandpa Henry. That evening, we celebrated at a local diner. Henry slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $1,000. "Investment capital," Henry said, cutting into his steak. "Go make your first deal. Stop working for the hardware store and start building your own damn doors." I didn't waste a second. I spent weeks scouring bank auction listings for foreclosures until I found the perfect disaster. It was a 3-bedroom house in a decent working-class neighborhood. It had been sitting empty for 8 months. The grass in the front yard was waist-high. The paint was peeling like a sunburn, and the interior smelled like mildew and desperation. The bank had it listed at $52,000, but I knew they were bleeding money on property taxes and wanted it gone. I spent 4 nights building a meticulous renovation budget spreadsheet. I walked into the bank, wearing a cheap suit, and offered them $45,000. The loan officer, a guy named Mr. Harrison, looked at me like I was a kid playing with Monopoly money. But when I slid my comprehensive business plan, my repair estimates, and my cash reserves across his desk, his smirk vanished. He approved the small business loan, using the property itself as collateral. I used Henry's $1,000 and my hardware store savings for the down payment. The house was officially mine, but buying it was the easy part. The crucible of the renovation almost broke me. I hired a local contractor named Greg to handle the heavy drywall and electrical work. Greg seemed like a great guy, slapped my back, called me boss, promised me a fair rate. 3 weeks into the project, I caught him sneaking bundles of expensive copper wiring and premium lumber out the back door and loading them into his truck. He was billing me for top-tier materials and installing cheap garbage, pocketing the difference. When I confronted him, Greg laughed in my face. "You're a kid, Chris. This is how the real world works. Pay my invoice or I walk, and good luck getting this dump up to code by yourself." He thought I would fold just like my father always did. Instead, I fired him on the spot and threatened him with a lawsuit for theft of materials. He drove off, cursing me out, leaving me with a half-gutted house and a ticking clock on my mortgage payments. I didn't have the budget to hire another contractor, so I had to become one. I worked my day job at the hardware store until 5, then drove straight to the property and worked until 2 in the morning. I learned plumbing by watching YouTube tutorials until my eyes burned. The first sink I installed leaked for 3 straight days until I realized I had put the gasket on backward. I learned electrical wiring the hard way, getting shocked more times than I care to admit. I spent my weekends pulling weeds, patching drywall until my knuckles bled, and sanding down the original oak hardwood floors I discovered under the rotting carpets. During this time, I also had to fend off vultures. A local real estate shark named Tom, who owned dozens of slums in the area, stopped by the property one afternoon. He saw me covered in paint and drywall dust, looking exhausted. He leaned against his expensive SUV and offered to buy the property off me for $40,000. A loss for me, telling me I was in over my head and bound for bankruptcy. "Cut your losses, kid," Tom sneered. "This game is for grown-ups." I looked Tom dead in the eye, wiped the sweat off my forehead, and told him to get off my property before I called the cops for trespassing. 6 brutal, agonizing months later, the house was finished. And it was beautiful. Fresh paint, gleaming hardwood floors, updated fixtures, and a fully landscaped yard. I had the property professionally appraised. Came back valued at $89,000. Through my own sweat, blood, and stubborn refusal to quit, I had forced $44,000 in equity out of a rotting piece of wood. I listed the house for rent. Within a week, I had 14 applications. I selected a stable, hardworking couple. Their monthly rent covered my mortgage, taxes, and insurance, and left me with $200 of pure profit every single month. I had done it. I had built something real. It wasn't just about the money. It was proof that I could take something broken, abandoned, and worthless, and transform it into something valuable. That surplus money went straight into savings for the next property. 8 months later, I bought a foreclosure duplex, then a single-family home. By the time I was 26, I owned 3 properties. By 28, I had 7. By 30, I was running a legitimate real estate investment company managing 15 properties, generating a massive, consistent monthly income. I was building my empire in total silence. I had money, respect, and a future, but the past has a funny way of resurrecting itself when you least expect it. My family was out there, drowning in the mess they had made, and soon, they would discover just how powerful the invisible sun had become. I thought I had successfully left Eleanor and Liam in my rearview mirror forever. But a devastating medical diagnosis was about to force us all back into the same room. And this time, I wasn't just bringing a cheap cake. I was bringing the hammer. I was 32 years old, standing on the balcony of a commercial property I had just acquired, when the phone call came. It was the kind of phone call that splits your life into a before and an after. The voice on the other end belonged to Grandpa Henry's neighbor. Henry had collapsed in his driveway. By the time I raced to the local hospital and found him in a sterile, brightly lit room, the doctors had already delivered the verdict. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was aggressive, it was unforgiving, and it left him with only a few months to live. My grandfather, a man carved from oak and stubborn pride, refused chemotherapy. He told the doctors he was not going to spend his final days hooked up to beeping machines in a room that smelled like bleach and pity. I brought him home, moved my laptop to his kitchen table, and effectively ran my real estate empire from his bedside. I cooked his meals, managed his pain medication, and listened to his stories. It was the hardest and most profoundly beautiful honor of my life. But tragedy acts like a blood in the water, and it did not take long for the sharks to start circling. Word of Henry's terminal illness eventually trickled down the family grapevine and reached my mother, Eleanor. I had not spoken to her in 9 years. Not a single text, not a single holiday card. But Eleanor was never one to let a tragedy go to waste, especially when she smelled a potential financial windfall. She knew Henry had a house, she knew he had assets, and she knew she was broke. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Henry was resting in the living room recliner. I was in the kitchen reviewing a commercial lease agreement when I heard a heavy knock on the front door. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach drop into my boots. It was Eleanor. She was holding a cheap plastic Tupperware container of baked ziti and wearing an expression of deep manufactured sorrow. I opened the door, but I did not step aside to let her in. I just filled the doorframe with my shoulders. "Chris?" she gasped, bringing a trembling hand to her chest as if seeing me was a religious experience. "Look at you. You have grown into such a handsome man. Please let your mother in." I came as soon as I heard about Henry. Family needs to stick together in times of crisis. I looked at her, really looked at her. The years had not been kind. The stress of maintaining a fake image and funding Liam's disastrous life had carved deep, bitter lines into her face. Her clothes looked tired. The facade was cracking. "You are not coming inside," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of anger, which I think terrified her more than if I had screamed. "You do not care about Henry. You hated him. You are here because you are circling the wagons for a payout. Turn around and go home, Eleanor." Her face flushed with sudden, venomous rage, but she quickly masked it with a sob. She placed the Tupperware on the porch rail and reached into her purse, pulling out a thick, sealed envelope. "I am your mother," she hissed, tears finally spilling over. "I have a right to see my family. But if you are going to be this cruel, just read the letter. Please, Chris. We are in desperate need." She turned and walked back to her rusted sedan, her shoulders shaking in a perfectly choreographed display of victimhood. I watched her drive away, then picked up the letter. I brought it inside and sat at the table with Henry, who had been awake and listening the whole time. He gave me a knowing nod. I opened the letter. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. 3 pages detailing how she had always loved both her children equally, how she had been doing her best in difficult circumstances, and how I had profoundly misunderstood her intentions. There was absolutely zero apology, just excuses wrapped in therapeutic buzzwords. But the final paragraph was the real reason for her visit. It read, "Your father's overtime hours got slashed. Liam got tangled up in a terrible lawsuit over a car accident that was not his fault, and the legal fees are drowning us. We are having severe financial difficulties. I know you must be making a decent salary now. Family helps family, Chris. We could really use a loan, or perhaps a portion of what Henry might leave behind. We are desperate." I read it aloud to Henry. He let out a dry, raspy chuckle that turned into a cough. "They have not changed a single bit," Henry whispered, leaning his head back against the recliner. "Still using people. Still expecting you to fix the messes they make. Let them drown, Chris. You built your own boat." I threw the letter in the trash. I did not respond. I spent the next few weeks completely focused on making Henry's final days as comfortable as possible. During this incredibly dark period, a massive point of light entered my life. Her name was Sarah. I met Sarah during the closing of a small office building I was purchasing. She was the opposing counsel, a real estate lawyer representing a seller who was trying to slip a massive environmental liability past my inspectors. Sarah walked into the boardroom wearing a sharp navy suit, carrying a briefcase that looked heavier than she was, and parked the keys to her silver Porsche on the table. She was completely unapologetic, fiercely intelligent, and cut through the legal jargon like a scalpel. Within 10 minutes of our meeting, she pointed out the flaws in her own client's contract, refusing to be party to fraud. I was deeply impressed. I asked her out for coffee after the deal inevitably fell through. We sat in a small cafe for 3 hours. I learned that she had grown up in a trailer park, put herself through law school by working 3 jobs, and had zero patience for people who made excuses. We bonded over our shared trauma of overcoming toxic family dynamics. Sarah's father had been an addict who drained their bank accounts, and her mother had enabled him until the day he vanished. Sarah understood my world. She understood why I guarded my peace so fiercely. When Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, Sarah was the one standing next to me. She held my hand as the paramedics took him away. The funeral was a small, dignified affair. I invited a few of Henry's old union buddies, some neighbors, and a handful of contractors I trusted. I did not invite Eleanor, Arthur, or Liam, but of course they showed up anyway. They walked into the chapel halfway through the service, dressed in black, making a massive, dramatic production of finding seats. Eleanor was holding a tissue to her face, sobbing loudly enough to draw stares. Liam looked hungover, constantly checking his phone. Arthur just looked at the floor, a hollow shell of a man. They were not there to mourn Henry. They were there to establish a public presence, to stake their claim as the grieving family in preparation for the inheritance they fully believed they were entitled to. I stood at the front of the chapel, delivering Henry's eulogy. I looked directly at Eleanor and Liam as I spoke about Henry's absolute intolerance for parasites and liars. Eleanor glared back at me, her eyes flashing with a promise of war. She thought I was just a bitter kid making a speech. She thought she held the ultimate authority because she was the daughter-in-law. She had no idea the trap had already been set, and she was walking straight into it with a smile on her face. 3 days after the funeral, the formal reading of the will took place. Henry had been meticulous about his estate planning. He wanted everything ironclad, leaving absolutely no room for Eleanor to contest his final wishes. The reading was held at Sarah's law firm. Yes, Sarah was not just my partner. She was now representing my legal interests. She knew every dark corner of my family's history, and she was ready for battle. I sat at the long mahogany conference table, nursing a cup of black coffee. Sarah sat beside me, organizing a stack of thick legal files. The heavy oak doors swung open, and in walked the circus. Eleanor marched in first, carrying herself with the unearned arrogance of a lottery winner stepping up to claim a giant check. She was wearing a tailored black dress that looked brand new. Liam trailed behind her, slumping into a leather chair and immediately crossing his arms defensively. Arthur came in last, shutting the door quietly and sitting as far away from the center of the table as possible. "Well, let us get this over with," Eleanor said briskly, clapping her hands together. "We have a lot of financial restructuring to do, and I want to see exactly what Henry left us. I assume Arthur is the primary beneficiary as his only living son." Sarah did not even look up from her paperwork. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Evans. I am Sarah Carter, the executor of Henry Evans's estate. We will begin now." Sarah began to read the document. It was brief and devastatingly precise. Henry left his vintage truck to a neighbor who had helped him mow the lawn. He left a small cash donation to the local library. And then Sarah reached the final clause. "To my grandson, Christopher Evans, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including the property located at 412 Elm Street, all liquid assets, and all investment portfolios. I leave absolutely nothing to Arthur, Eleanor, or Liam Evans. You have taken enough from this world without earning it. This decision is final and uncontestable." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. And then, the explosion happened. "What?" Eleanor shrieked, slamming her hands on the table and shooting to her feet. "That is impossible. That is fraudulent. Arthur is his son. We are legally entitled to that inheritance." Henry was clearly not of sound mind when he signed that garbage. Mrs. Evans, I strongly advise you to lower your voice, Sarah said. Her tone is cold and hard as a diamond. The will was drafted, signed, and notarized 3 years ago, accompanied by a full psychiatric evaluation proving Henry's absolute mental competence. If you attempt to contest this in court, you will lose, and you will pay my legal fees when you do. Liam sat forward, his face turning red. You cannot do this, Chris. You know I am drowning in debt. I have that lawsuit from the car crash. My credit is ruined, and I can't even get a decent salary anywhere. You have to split this with us. It is the right thing to do. I looked at Liam, the golden child, the boy who laughed about my ruined birthdays. The right thing to do? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Like faking a mental breakdown to hide your failing grades? Like spending $40,000 of our parents' money on frat parties while I was sweeping floors for minimum wage? Eleanor pointed a shaking finger at me. You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat. You think you have won because an old man gave you a house? You are nothing. You have always been nothing. We are going to lose our home because your father's overtime got cut and the bank is threatening foreclosure. If you do not write us a check today, you are putting your own family on the street. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I set the mug down perfectly in the center of the coaster. Then I turned to Sarah and gave her a slight nod. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick, red folder. She slid it across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of Eleanor. What is this? Eleanor snapped, looking at the folder like it was a live grenade. Open it, I said. Eleanor practically tore the cover open. Her eyes darted across the legal jargon on the first page. Arthur leaned over to look. Liam just stared in confusion. I don't understand, Arthur whispered, his face turning completely pale. This is the deed to our house, and the mortgage papers. Let me clarify the situation for you, I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. For the past 9 years, while you were taking out second and third mortgages on your home to pay for Liam's lawsuits, his lifestyle, and his sheer incompetence, I was building a real estate investment firm, a very successful one. I paused, letting the words sink in. Eleanor's mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide with mounting horror. 6 months ago, Mr. Harrison at the local commercial bank, the bank holding your dangerously delinquent mortgage, bundled a series of distressed debts to sell off to private investment firms. I continued smoothly. My LLC purchased that bundle. I bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles were bone white. You, she stammered, unable to form a complete sentence. Yes, Eleanor, I said, looking directly into the eyes of the woman who had made my childhood a living hell. I am your primary debt holder. I own the mortgage on the house you are living in. I am your landlord. And according to these documents, you are currently 4 months behind on your payments. The power shift in the room was so violent it felt like the air pressure had changed. The arrogant, demanding mother who had walked in 10 minutes ago was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, trapped woman staring at the son she had thrown away. Chris, please, Arthur begged, his voice cracking, tears finally falling down his weathered cheeks. Please do not take the house. Where will we go? You can stay, I said coldly, if you pay the rent at the current market rate, due on the 1st of every month. But the days of living beyond your means are over. If you miss a single payment, Sarah will begin eviction proceedings on day 2. There will be no warnings. There will be no family discounts. You are going to learn how the real world works starting today. Liam jumped out of his chair, his fists clenched. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. You lost the right to call yourselves my family the night you canceled my 23rd birthday to cover up a lie, I replied, standing up. I towered over Liam, and for the first time in his life, he actually backed away in fear. I took Grandpa Henry's college fund, and I built an empire. You took $40,000, and you built a mountain of garbage. We are done here. I turned my back on them and walked out of the boardroom, Sarah right beside me. Behind the heavy oak doors, I could hear the sounds of Eleanor finally breaking down into real, agonizing sobs, and the sound of Arthur screaming at Liam for destroying their lives. It was the sound of absolute consequences finally coming home to roost. The fallout from that meeting in the boardroom was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. Once the reality of their financial ruin set in, the fragile, toxic ecosystem of my childhood home completely collapsed. They could no longer pretend everything was fine because the bank statements had my name at the top. Aunt Diane was the first domino to fall. She had always known Eleanor was a manipulative nightmare, but the revelation that I, the nephew she had silently pitted, now owned the family home was the catalyst she needed to finally speak her mind. During a disastrous family dinner that Eleanor tried to host to rally support, Diane stood up at the table, threw her napkin down, and verbally eviscerated my mother. Diane called out decades of emotional abuse, favoritism, and financial insanity. She told Eleanor that she had dug her own grave and refused to lend them a single dime. Diane walked out of that house and never spoke to Eleanor again. But the most shocking transformation came from my father, Arthur. Stripped of all his illusions, staring down the barrel of an eviction notice served by his own son, something inside that broken man finally snapped. For 30 years, he had chosen the path of least resistance, letting Eleanor dictate his entire existence. Now, the resistance had crushed him. 2 weeks after the will reading, Arthur packed 2 suitcases, loaded them into his rusted sedan, and drove away from the house. He filed for divorce the very next morning. Eleanor tried to fight it, demanding alimony and a share of his pension. But Arthur hired a cutthroat lawyer who dragged Eleanor's financial mismanagement into the bright lights of a courtroom. The judge was not sympathetic to a woman who had secretly drained retirement accounts to fund her adult son's legal defense for a drunken car crash. Arthur moved into a tiny, one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. He sent me a handwritten letter. It was not an excuse. It was a genuine, agonizing apology. He wrote that he did not expect forgiveness, but he wanted me to know that he was finally taking responsibility for his cowardice. He started attending therapy. He started living honestly. As for Liam, the golden child crashed harder than anyone. Without Arthur's paycheck to subsidize his life, and with Eleanor panicking over the rent she now owed me, Liam was unceremoniously kicked out of the nest. He ended up crashing on a friend's couch until he wore out his welcome. Reality hit him like a freight train. He had no degree, no skills, and a terrible attitude. He was forced to take a job working the deep fryer at a local fast food restaurant. I heard through the grapevine that he was begging his manager for a promotion to shift supervisor just so he could afford to pay child support. Yes, Liam had gotten his on-again, off-again girlfriend pregnant, and he was currently engaged in a messy, humiliating custody battle that was forcing him to finally grow up and face the music. He was learning the value of $1 the hardest way possible. Meanwhile, my life was moving forward beautifully. The darkness of my past was firmly behind me. Sarah and I continued to build our lives together. She was brilliant, fiercely loyal, and understood exactly how to protect the peace we had built. A year after Henry passed, I asked Sarah to marry me. We were standing in the kitchen of the very first foreclosure property I had ever renovated, the place where I learned how to swing a hammer and fix my own life. She said yes before I even finished the question. Our wedding was incredibly small, just 50 people. There were no extravagant ice sculptures, no forced family photos, and absolutely no drama. Just our closest friends, colleagues, and the people who genuinely loved us. It was a celebration of what we had built, not what we were given. I was no longer the invisible son holding a grocery store cake. I was a man who commanded respect, not through manipulation, but through undeniable results. But I knew that true healing wasn't just about financial dominance or revenge. It was about taking the pain of the past and transforming it into something that could actually help others. It was time to honor the only man who had ever believed in me. 5 years have passed since the day I handed Eleanor her mortgage papers. I am 37 now. My real estate company has grown into a multi-million-dollar development firm. I do not just flip houses anymore. I build communities. But the project I am most proud of does not generate a single dime of profit. Using the initial capital from Grandpa Henry's inheritance, I purchased a massive, abandoned warehouse in the poorest district of our city. Sarah and I spent 2 years navigating zoning laws, securing permits, and personally overseeing the renovation. We transformed that rotting brick shell into a state-of-the-art community center. We named it the Henry Evans Foundation. It has a free computer lab for low-income students, job training workshops for adults trying to re-enter the workforce, and a legal clinic where Sarah provides pro bono advice for families facing unlawful evictions. We even built a small community kitchen that serves hot meals. We charge exactly $1 per meal, allowing people to keep their dignity while getting the help they need. The grand opening of the foundation was the proudest day of my life. Hundreds of people from the neighborhood showed up. The mayor cut the ribbon, and standing in the back of the crowd, keeping a respectful distance, were 2 people I never thought I would see in a positive light again. My father, Arthur, was there. He looked healthier than he had in 20 years. The heavy, defeated slump in his shoulders was gone. Standing next to him was his new partner, Martha. She was a kind, quiet woman who managed a local bakery. She treated Arthur with respect, and in return, he treated her like an equal. He caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, proud salute. I nodded back. We were not best friends, but we had found a peaceful, respectful boundary. And then there was Liam. He looked tired, older, with bags under his eyes. He was wearing a cheap, but clean, button-down shirt. He was holding the hand of a little 3-year-old boy, little Leo. Liam had fought for partial custody, and to my absolute shock, he was actually showing up for his son. He was still working at the diner, grinding out 50 hours a week, but he was sober, and the arrogant smirk that used to define his face had been replaced by the quiet humility of a man who knew he had to earn every inch of his life. Liam walked up to me after the speeches. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make excuses. He just looked at the massive community center around us, looked at me and said, "You did good, Chris. Grandpa would be really proud." "Thanks, Liam," I replied. "Keep taking care of the kid." He nodded, picked Leo up, and walked away. It wasn't a movie-perfect reconciliation, but it was real, and it was enough. As for Eleanor, she never changed. She still lives in the house, stubbornly scraping together the rent she pays to my LLC every month. She works as a receptionist at a dental office, a job she considers beneath her, and spends her lunch breaks complaining to anyone who will listen about her cruel, ungrateful son who abandoned her and stole her house. She is trapped in a prison of her own making, utterly consumed by bitterness. When I think about her now, I don't feel anger. I don't feel sadness. I feel absolute indifference. And that, my friends, is the greatest revelation of this entire journey. You see, toxic people want you to be angry. They want you to scream, to fight, to engage, because as long as you are reacting to them, they still control your emotional thermostat. They still matter. But when you finally detach, when you focus entirely on building your own life, your own wealth, and your own family, their voices become nothing more than static on a broken radio. The best revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you. The best revenge is proving to yourself that their assessment of your worth was completely, pathetically wrong. I took the scraps they threw at me, the $6 cakes and the $500 payoffs, and I built an impenetrable fortress. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to cut off the people who were supposed to love you the most just to survive? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Keep building your empire, and never let anyone tell you that you are invisible.